It was December 23rd, and the Christmas spirit was palpable in the small town of Oak Ridge. Carolers roamed the streets, homes glistened with multicolored lights, and the aroma of cinnamon and pine filled the frosty air. For Stephanie, the season was bittersweet. Having just moved into a quaint Victorian rental house on the edge of town, she was eager to start fresh after a particularly difficult year. Still, the weight of spending Christmas alone lingered in the corners of her mind. The house was a beautiful old structure with towering ceilings, bay windows, and a wraparound porch. Its charm was undeniable, but it also felt oddly isolating. Neighbors were few and far between, and the dense woods surrounding the property seemed to absorb every sound. After unpacking the last of her boxes, Stephanie set about decorating for the holidays. She'd picked up a small artificial tree at the hardware store along with a box of vintage ornaments she found at a thrift shop. The ornaments had caught her eye immediately. Each was hand-painted and uniquely detailed, depicting scenes of wintry landscapes, angelic choirs, and even eerie midnight gatherings. They had an old-world feel that she couldn't resist. As the night wore on, she hung the ornaments carefully, humming along to Christmas music. The final touch was a star she placed delicately at the top. She stepped back to admire her work and felt a small flicker of joy. This was her Christmas, and she was determined to make the most of it. Around 10 p.m., as she curled up on the couch with a cup of hot chocolate, she noticed something odd. One of the ornaments, a small church painted against a dark, stormy sky, seemed to be tilted on the branch. She could have sworn it was straight when she hung it. Brushing it off as her imagination, she adjusted the ornament and settled back down. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. The lights on the tree flickered, though the rest of the house seemed unaffected. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and bending in ways that didn't align with the warm glow of the fireplace. And then, faintly, she heard it, a distant hum, like the murmur of voices just beyond her hearing. Stephanie froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the sound of carolers. It was too soft, too low. The voices seemed to rise and fall, almost like chanting. She got up and peered out the window. The front yard was blanketed in snow, untouched except for the faint outline of trees silhouetted by the moonlight. There was no one there. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. The screen displayed a text from an unknown number. "Do not answer the door tonight." Her stomach dropped. She stared at the message, trying to process its meaning. It had to be a prank, she told herself, some cruel joke from a wrong number. But the timing was unnerving. Who would send such a message right now, while she was already on edge? Before she could decide whether to respond, a knock echoed through the house. It was sharp and deliberate, not the gentle tap of a neighbor stopping by. Stephanie's heart pounded. She moved to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty. The knock came again, louder this time. She jumped back, her breath hitching. She glanced at her phone, the cryptic message flashing in her mind. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Who's there?" There was no reply, only silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an electric tension that made her skin crawl. And then, the singing began. It was faint at first, like a distant choir carried on the wind. But as it grew louder, Stephanie realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the living room. The ornaments on the tree were spinning, slowly at first, then faster, their painted surfaces blurring into streaks of color. The hum of voices grew louder, intertwining in an eerie, discordant harmony. Stephanie backed away, clutching her phone. The room grew colder. Frost began to creep across the windows, spreading in jagged patterns. The lights on the tree flickered wildly before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Stephanie's breath came in short gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The singing reached a crescendo, a deafening roar of voices that seemed to come from every corner of the house. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the singing stopped. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. Stephanie slowly lowered her hands, her ears ringing in the absence of sound. She turned toward the tree, now shrouded in darkness. The ornaments hung still, their painted surfaces glinting faintly in the moonlight. And then, she saw it. In the reflection of the tree's glass ornaments, figures moved. Cloaked in shadow, they circled her, their movements slow and deliberate. Stephanie spun around, but the room was empty. Yet the reflections didn't lie. The figures were there, just out of reach, watching her. A sudden, rhythmic pounding broke her paralysis. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the basement. The sound was relentless, like fists hammering against wood. Stephanie wanted to run, to get in her car and drive until she was far from the house. But her legs refused to move. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. It was as if whatever was down there was desperate to get out. Gathering every ounce of courage she had left, Stephanie grabbed a flashlight and the fireplace poker and made her way to the basement door. The air grew colder with each step, her breath visible in the dim light. She reached the door and hesitated, her hand trembling on the handle. The pounding stopped. In the silence that followed, Stephanie pressed her ear to the door, listening. A single, faint whisper slithered through the wood. "Let us in." Her grip tightened on the poker as she yanked the door open, shining her flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light illuminated the basement, a space cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes. There was no one there. She descended slowly, each creak of the stairs echoing like a gunshot. The air was damp, and the musty smell of decay filled her nostrils. As she reached the bottom, her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, the ornaments from her tree were scattered in a perfect circle, their painted surfaces glistening with frost. Stephanie knelt to examine them, her breath hitching when she noticed something chilling. Each ornament now depicted a single figure, cloaked and faceless, standing in the snow. The flashlight flickered again and went out completely, plunging the basement into darkness. In that moment, the singing returned, louder and closer than ever. A single, cold hand rested on her shoulder, and the last thing Stephanie heard before everything went black was a voice whispering, "You shouldn't have opened the door." Snow fell steadily over the quiet town of Windmere, blanketing the streets in an unbroken sheet of white. It was Christmas Eve, and most of the town's residents were tucked away in their homes, their windows glowing warmly with festive lights. The streets were silent, save for the occasional crunch of boots or the hum of a passing car. For Nick, it was the perfect night to relax. His family was out of town, and for the first time in years, he had the house to himself. The small ranch-style home he'd inherited from his grandfather had seen better days, but Nick didn't mind. It was cozy, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by woods that stretched out for miles. He'd spent the evening decorating a modest Christmas tree with ornaments he found in the attic. Most of them were decades old, but they carried a charm that made the house feel a little less lonely. By 10 p.m., the tree sparkled in the corner of the living room, casting soft shadows across the walls. Nick poured himself a whiskey, sank into the recliner, and turned on an old black and white Christmas movie. As the hours passed, the storm outside intensified. Wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames. Nick pulled a blanket over his legs and sipped his drink, letting the soft glow of the tree lull him into a state of calm. He was just about to drift off when he heard it, a sharp knock at the front door. He froze. The house was isolated, surrounded by empty woods and farmland. Who could possibly be out there in a storm like this? He waited, heart thudding in his chest, but the knock didn't come again. Curiosity got the better of him. Nick stood and made his way to the door, peeking through the peephole. The porch light cast a dim halo onto the snow-covered steps, but there was no one there. Only the wind howled back at him, carrying flurries of snow across the yard. "Must have been the wind," he muttered to himself, locking the door again. But as he turned away, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Nick whipped around, his pulse quickening. He leaned toward the peephole again, squinting into the distorted fisheye view. The porch was still empty. He opened his mouth to call out, but something stopped him. A deep unease crept up his spine, and he decided against it. Instead, he turned off the porch light and went back to his chair, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The wind continued to batter the house, but the knocking didn't come again. Or so he thought. At precisely midnight, Nick was startled awake by a loud crash. He bolted upright, heart pounding, as the sound echoed through the house. It was coming from the back porch. Grabbing a flashlight and the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, a rusty fireplace poker, he crept toward the noise. The back porch was enclosed by floor-to-ceiling windows, and through the frosted glass, Nick could make out a dark figure standing motionless in the snow. It was tall, unnaturally so, with broad shoulders and long limbs. Its head was tilted slightly, as if observing him. Nick's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. A loud thud reverberated through the house, this time from the roof. Nick spun around, his heart racing. He'd never believed in the supernatural, but there was no logical explanation for what was happening. The thudding continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking across the roof. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The house responded with silence. Nick backed into the living room, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. The Christmas tree sparkled innocently in the corner, its ornaments swaying gently as if disturbed by a draft. But there was no draft. Nick had checked every window and door before settling in for the night. The sound of footsteps on the roof grew louder, moving toward the chimney. Nick's eyes darted to the fireplace, dread pooling in his stomach. He thought of old stories, tales meant to scare children into behaving. He tried to tell himself it was ridiculous, but the pounding of his heart told him otherwise. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was almost worse. Nick stood frozen, his knuckles white around the poker, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Just as he began to let his guard down, the television flickered to life. Static filled the screen, hissing loudly in the quiet room. Nick jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. The remote sat untouched on the coffee table. "What the hell?" he muttered, inching toward the TV. He picked up the remote and pressed the power button, but the static remained. As he fumbled with the controls, the static began to fade, replaced by an image that made his blood run cold. It was a live feed of his front porch. The camera angle was strange, as if the footage was being taken from just above the doorframe. The porch was empty at first, but then the figure reappeared, stepping into view. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking as if it didn't quite understand how to walk. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Nick could feel its gaze boring into him through the screen. The figure raised one long, spindly hand and pointed directly at the camera. And then it knocked. 3 loud, deliberate knocks echoed through the house, perfectly timed with the video. Nick stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The knocking stopped, but the figure remained on the screen, unmoving. Nick's phone buzzed on the couch, and he snatched it up with trembling hands. Another text from an unknown number. "Let it in." "No," Nick whispered, shaking his head. He typed out a frantic reply. "Who is this?" But the message failed to send. He tried calling 911, but the line crackled with static before disconnecting. Desperation clawed at him as he looked back at the TV. The screen was black, and then the front door creaked open. Nick's stomach lurched. He hadn't unlocked it. He was sure of that. The air grew colder, and a deep, guttural hum filled the house, resonating through the walls. Slowly, he turned toward the doorway. The figure stood in the threshold, its hooded head nearly brushing the top of the frame. Its hand reached out, impossibly long fingers curling toward him. Nick screamed. The next morning, neighbors found the house empty, the front door wide open. Snow had drifted into the living room, covering the floor in a pristine layer of white. The Christmas tree stood undisturbed, its lights still twinkling. But Nick was gone. All that remained was a single text message left unsent on his phone. "Don't let it in." It was the kind of winter night that felt like it could stretch forever. Still, bitterly cold, and unnervingly quiet. The snow-covered streets of Hawthorne Ridge were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of Christmas lights from the houses lining the main road. Emma tightened her scarf around her neck as she walked briskly home from the bookstore where she worked. She loved the holidays, but something about this Christmas felt different. Off. Her small rental home sat at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, partially hidden by towering pines. The house was charming enough, with a steeply pitched roof and a front porch that creaked in protest whenever the wind blew too hard. Emma had spent the past week decorating it, stringing lights along the gutters and placing a wreath on the door. But tonight, as she approached the house, she felt a pang of unease. The porch light was off. Emma frowned. She always left it on when she knew she'd be coming home late. Her hands fumbled for her keys as she climbed the steps, the wooden boards groaning under her weight. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath forming small clouds in the icy air. The street behind her was empty. Finally, the key turned, and she pushed the door open. The house greeted her with its familiar stillness, the faint scent of pine needles and cinnamon from the candle she'd burned earlier that morning lingering in the air. She reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. Grumbling under her breath, Emma set her bag down and made her way to the kitchen to grab a flashlight. The faint light from the snow outside barely illuminated the interior, casting the furniture in vague, hulking shadows. She tried to ignore the creeping sensation at the back of her neck, the feeling that she wasn't alone. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, and Emma sighed with relief. She went back to the living room to check the breaker box near the front window. Kneeling down, she flipped a few switches, but nothing changed. Great. A power outage, just in time for Christmas Eve. As she stood up, her gaze drifted to the window. The street beyond was cloaked in shadow, but there was something else, movement. A figure, barely visible against the snow, was standing in the middle of the road. Emma's breath caught. She couldn't make out any details, but the figure was tall and still, like a mannequin placed in the center of the street. She stared for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move, to step closer or retreat into the trees. It didn't. She let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, her pulse quickening. It's just a neighbor, she told herself. Someone walking home late, maybe lost in thought. But even as she tried to rationalize it, her mind couldn't shake the unsettling image of the figure standing motionless in the snow. Shaking her head, she decided to distract herself by lighting the small Christmas tree she'd set up in the corner of the room. The battery-operated string lights still worked, casting a soft, warm glow over the ornaments she'd carefully hung the night before. The sight should have been comforting, but instead, it made the shadows in the room seem darker. A knock at the door made her jump. It wasn't a friendly knock, like the kind you'd expect from a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. It was sharp, deliberate, and slow. 3 heavy thuds, spaced just far enough apart to make her skin crawl. Emma froze, the flashlight shaking in her grip. She glanced back at the window, but the figure in the street was gone. The knock came again, louder this time. She approached the door cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, indecision gnawing at her. The rational part of her brain screamed not to open it, but curiosity and fear got the better of her. She turned the knob and pulled the door open just a crack, enough to peer outside. The porch was empty. The snow on the steps was undisturbed, untouched by footprints. Emma leaned out slightly, her eyes scanning the street, but there was no one there. Just the same oppressive quiet and the distant hum of wind through the trees. "Hello," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Shaking her head, she closed the door and locked it, sliding the chain across for good measure. She leaned against it for a moment, her breath shallow. Maybe she was just imagining things. Maybe the figure in the street and the knock at the door weren't connected at all. But deep down, she didn't believe that. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Emma kept the flashlight close, checking the windows every so often but finding nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and she retreated to her bedroom. She left the Christmas tree lights on, their soft glow spilling into the hallway, as a small comfort against the darkness. She lay in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint creaks and groans of the old house. Just as her eyes began to grow heavy, a new sound jolted her awake. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A soft, lilting hum, almost like someone singing. The melody was unfamiliar, haunting in its simplicity. Emma sat up, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from outside her window. She moved to the edge of the bed, her feet touching the cold hardwood floor. Slowly, she approached the window and pulled back the curtain. The figure was back. It stood just beyond the glow of the Christmas tree lights, its outline barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows. But this time, it wasn't alone. Two more figures flanked it, their bodies unnaturally still, their heads tilted slightly as though observing her. Emma's breath hitched. The humming stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. One of the figures raised an arm and pointed directly at her window. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered and went out. Emma's scream was caught in her throat as the room was plunged into darkness. The glow from the Christmas tree vanished, leaving her bedroom in a suffocating void of shadows. She stumbled back from the window, the faint crunch of snow outside growing louder, closer. The figures were moving. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she fumbled for the flashlight on her nightstand. The beams sputtered to life, casting wild streaks of light across the walls. She aimed it toward the window, but the figures were gone. All that remained was the undisturbed snow and the skeletal outlines of the pines beyond the yard. The faint hum began again, soft and lilting, carried on the icy wind. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Emma knew she should call someone, anyone, but her phone sat charging in the kitchen downstairs. She'd left it there earlier, thinking she wouldn't need it. Now, the thought of leaving the perceived safety of her bedroom filled her with dread. The humming grew louder, joined by a rhythmic tapping sound. Emma's breath caught as she realized it was coming from the walls, gentle, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers just inches from her. She pressed her ear to the wall, her heart pounding. The tapping stopped, and then, a voice. It was faint and distorted, like hearing someone speak underwater, but unmistakably there. "Let us in," it whispered, each word drawn out, reverberating through the walls. Emma recoiled, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She ran to the door and locked it, her shaking hands fumbling with the latch. She pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. What was happening? She'd heard stories about strange occurrences in the woods surrounding Hawthorne Ridge, whispered warnings from the locals at the bookstore, but she'd always dismissed them as folklore. Now, those tales felt all too real. Minutes dragged into agonizing silence. Emma forced herself to take deep breaths, her mind grasping for any logical explanation. But deep down, she knew this was something far beyond her understanding. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. She slapped it against her palm, trying to coax it back to life. As the light stabilized, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural scraping. It was coming from the front of the house. Her mind raced. Was it an animal? A branch against the siding? Or no, she couldn't finish the thought. The scraping moved, slow and deliberate, circling the house. It paused beneath her bedroom window before continuing toward the back door. Emma clenched the flashlight, every nerve in her body screaming for her to stay put. But if someone, or something, was trying to get in, she couldn't just sit there. Summoning her courage, she unlocked the bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. The glow from the Christmas tree was still out, leaving the house bathed in eerie shadows. She crept toward the stairs, her breath hitching with every sound. The scraping stopped. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise itself. Emma froze, listening, and then she heard it. A sharp knock at the back door, followed by the unmistakable sound of the latch jiggling. Someone was trying to get in. She hurried down the stairs, the flashlight's beam bouncing erratically. When she reached the kitchen, her eyes darted to the back door. The frosted glass pane was fogged over, but there was no mistaking the shape on the other side. A tall, angular figure pressed against the door, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Emma's breath hitched. She backed away, her hand blindly searching for her phone on the counter. Her fingers closed around it just as the knocking stopped. The figure was gone. Her trembling hands fumbled to unlock the phone. She dialed 911, her voice shaking as the operator answered. "There's someone outside my house," she stammered. "They're trying to get in." The operator's tone was calm, almost eerily so. "Stay inside, ma'am. Lock all doors and windows. Officers are on their way." Emma hung up and double-checked the locks on every door and window in the kitchen. She tried to calm herself, but the house felt alive now, the walls almost humming with tension. She glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. The power flickered back on. The Christmas tree's lights sprang to life, casting their soft, multicolored glow into the living room. For a brief moment, Emma felt a flicker of relief. But then she noticed the ornaments. They'd been rearranged. She hadn't touched them since decorating the tree, yet now they were hanging in perfect concentric circles, spiraling inward like a vortex. In the center of the tree, a single ornament stood out, a small, hand-painted figure of a cloaked man standing in a snowy field. Emma's skin crawled. She didn't own an ornament like that. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the back door on its hinges. Emma spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the kitchen. The shadow of the figure loomed against the frosted glass, its hand pressed flat against the pane. And then it spoke. "Let us in." The voice was wrong, distorted, as if layered with dozens of others. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Emma backed away, clutching the phone to her chest. The figure's hand dragged down the glass, leaving long streaks as it disappeared into the darkness. The lights flickered again, plunging the house into darkness once more. Emma's phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down to see a new message from an unknown number. "You can't keep us out forever." Her stomach twisted. She dropped the phone and ran for the living room, slamming the door behind her. The Christmas tree glowed faintly in the darkened room, the eerie ornament still hanging at its center. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each step. Emma held her breath, the flashlight beam shaking in her hands. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room door. A single knock, and then the door creaked open. Emma's scream filled the room as the figures stepped inside. There were 3 of them, their cloaked forms towering over her, their faces obscured by shadow. The humming began again, louder this time, filling the room with its oppressive melody. The ornaments on the tree began to spin, faster and faster, their painted surfaces blurring into streaks of color. The cloaked figures moved closer, their hands outstretched. The lights went out. When the police arrived the next morning, the house was empty. The back door was ajar, snow drifting in to cover the kitchen floor. In the living room, the Christmas tree stood untouched, its ornaments perfectly arranged in spiraling circles. Emma was gone. On the tree's lowest branch, a new ornament had been added. A small, hand-painted figure of a woman standing in a snowy field, her face frozen in terror. And outside, deep in the woods, the humming continued.